You open the fridge, and there's no cold water, just warm bottles in the door. You sigh like it's a tragedy. 60 days ago, the last river near this camp was ankle deep. Today, it's a memory. And if you don't find water in the next 72 hours, it stops being a bad day and starts being the end of your bloodline. For most of human history, drought wasn't a news headline. It was a slow-motion emergency that could erase an entire group of people without a single predator, a single disease, or a single fight. And the fact that any of us are here at all means somebody, somewhere, figured out how to beat it. Here's the number that should scare you. The human body can survive roughly 3 days without water before organ failure begins. 3 days. Food, you can go weeks without. Water gives you 72 hours, tops, and that clock doesn't pause for anything. Not heat, not walking, not waiting for rain that might not come for 2 more months. So the question isn't really how did ancient humans survive drought? It's how did they survive a death sentence with a 3-day fuse, repeated for 60 straight days? And the answer starts somewhere you'd never think to look. The first skill wasn't digging. It was knowing exactly where to dig, and that meant reading a landscape most of us would call just dirt. Ancient foragers tracked which plant species only grow directly above shallow groundwater. Certain reeds, certain grasses that stay stubbornly green while everything around them has already died. A patch of green in a field of brown wasn't scenery. It was a map marker. Some plants go further than just marking a spot. They actually indicate depth. A certain type of eucalyptus in the Australian outback sends roots down as deep as 40 meters chasing groundwater. And traditional Aboriginal trackers learned to read the specific bark and leaf color of these trees to judge roughly how far down the water sat before anyone ever put a shovel in the ground. And it wasn't just plants. Animal behavior gave the location away too. Birds circling a specific spot at dusk. Insect swarms clustering low to the ground. Animal trails all bending toward the same invisible point. Doves and finches in particular fly toward water sources at first and last light, in nearly straight lines, which meant a person willing to sit still and watch the sky for 20 minutes at dawn could learn more than a full day of blind wandering ever would. Read enough of those signs together, and you had a working map of every hidden water source for miles, memorized and passed down for generations before a single word of it was ever written anywhere. But finding the spot was only step one, because the water wasn't sitting there in a puddle waiting for you. It was hiding. In dry riverbeds, the cracked, sandy channels where a river used to run, water often doesn't vanish. It just sinks a foot or two below the surface and keeps flowing quietly underground. Dig down through the sand in the right spot, and water seeps up to fill the hole. It's called a seep well, and it's one of the oldest known water gathering techniques on Earth, still used by traditional desert communities in parts of Africa and Australia today. But digging that hole in 100-degree heat burns water and energy you don't have to spare, which meant the group couldn't just have everyone digging at once. Someone had to plan it: who digs, who rests in the shade, who watches for predators drawn to the same scarce water. A 60-day drought turned into a logistics problem, solved with 0 written records and 0 margin for error. And in places with no riverbeds at all, there was an even stranger trick: plants as canteens. Certain roots and tubers store water inside themselves the way a camel stores fat. Crack one open in the right season, and you're not eating dinner. You're drinking it. In parts of the Kalahari, one particular wild melon can hold enough liquid to keep a single adult alive for close to a full day, and traditional foragers there learned to identify which of these melons had gone bitter and toxic simply by smell, a skill that took years to build and could not be rushed. So now you've got water, rationed and hard-won. But water alone doesn't answer the second question a 60-day drought forces on you, because the animals you'd normally hunt are dying too, or they've already left. When the land dries out, prey animals don't just disappear randomly, they migrate toward whatever water is left, often along predictable routes shaped by geography. Ancient humans didn't wait for the herd to come back. They tracked the migration and moved the entire camp to intercept it, sometimes walking dozens of miles based on nothing but memorized seasonal patterns. That's a genuinely brutal trade-off. Moving camp during a drought burns precious water reserves just to chase food that might not even be there when you arrive. Every decision during those 60 days was a bet, made with life or death stakes and incomplete information, and the groups who guessed wrong simply didn't make it to the other side. And when the herds thinned out entirely, some groups turned to a food source most people today would never think twice about: insects. Termite mounds and locust swarms don't need rain to appear the way large game does, and gram for gram, both are more protein dense than most meat. A group that knew how to harvest them didn't just survive a drought, they sometimes came through it healthier than the years before, simply because they weren't relying on a single, unreliable food source the way a pure hunting strategy would have forced them to. Even carrion, animals that had already died of thirst themselves, became fair game during the worst stretches. Something that would have been considered wasteful or even taboo in a normal year, but turned into common sense once the math of survival changed. But finding water and finding food only solves half the problem, because the body itself was working against you the entire time, and ancient humans had to outthink their own biology just to stretch what little water they had. The obvious move was to stop moving during the worst heat of the day. Groups living through prolonged drought shifted almost all physical activity to the early morning and late evening, resting through the hottest hours in whatever shade they could find, sometimes even digging shallow depressions in the earth to lie in because ground temperature drops noticeably just a few inches down. A body at rest in the shade can lose water at a fraction of the rate of a body working under direct sun, which meant simply choosing when not to move was, in a very real sense, a survival technology in its own right. There's also a quieter piece of human biology that helped, one most people never think about. Compared to many other mammals, humans are unusually good at concentrating urine and minimizing water loss through sweat when genuinely dehydrated, an adaptation some researchers link back to our species' long evolutionary relationship with hot, dry African savannas in the first place. In other words, some of what got us through a 60-day drought wasn't cleverness at all. It was baked into the body millions of years before anyone had to use it on purpose. Here's the part that should genuinely stop you. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups living in drought-prone regions like the Hadza in Tanzania and the San in the Kalahari show something researchers didn't expect. Sharing actually increases during the worst scarcity, not decreases. When food and water get scarcest, groups don't fracture into every person for themselves. They tighten their sharing networks because a person who starves alone today is a person who can't help you survive tomorrow. In other words, the drought that should have turned people against each other may have done the opposite. It's one of the oldest, harshest proofs that cooperation isn't a nice-to-have for humans. It's a survival technology, tested under the worst conditions the environment could throw at us, and it held. Anthropologists studying these groups have found that the individuals who shared the most during hard times were, over the long run, the ones with the strongest social safety net when their own luck ran out. Which means generosity during a drought wasn't just kindness. It was arguably the smartest insurance policy available with the tools they had. This kind of reciprocity also shows up in something researchers call delayed exchange, where one family shares meat or water today with no immediate payback expected because everyone understands the favor will be returned months or even years later whenever the tables turn. That's an enormous amount of trust to place in another person with absolutely no written contract, no currency, and no enforcement mechanism except memory and reputation. And yet it worked well enough generation after generation that it became one of the quiet, load-bearing habits of the entire species. If the idea that sharing your last sip of water is literally written into why humans survived at all is the kind of thing that messes with your head a little, that's the whole channel. Subscribe. There's more of this coming. And when the rain finally did come, back after 60 dry days, it wasn't relief. It was danger of a completely different kind. Parched, cracked earth can't absorb water fast enough, which means the first heavy rain after a long drought often causes flash flooding. Some groups who'd survived 2 straight months without water drowned in the first storm that ended it. The very thing they'd been praying for arrived like an ambush, and the groups who survived that too were usually the ones who had learned, from bitter experience, to move to higher ground the moment the sky finally broke rather than running straight toward the sound of water. So next time your tap water runs a little warm, or your delivery order is late, remember what that same thirst used to cost. It cost a map memorized across generations. It cost a hole dug by hand in 100-degree heat. It cost a gamble on a herd that might not show up. And it cost, or maybe it built, a habit of sharing the last sip with the person next to you. Because that habit is the reason any of us are standing here at all. You've never been 60 days from your last drop of water. Somebody you're descended from was. More than once. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.